Coming up on this week's show, Nintendo announced a huge new remake.
A rare Mega Drive has been spotted.
And we get the story of Atari's Pac-Man and Swordquest with Tod Frye.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every Friday with our incredible friends at Bitmap Books. Now, if you want some good reading for the summer, check out PC Engine, the Box Art Collection. Now, this incredible late 80s console just had so much vibrancy, sophistication, so much personality, and this covers some of the most interesting Japanese releases for this powerhouse system, including Adventure Island, Soldier Blade, Bomberman 93, Street Fighter 2, the Champion Edition, are coming in at 372 pages. This is definitely worth a read if you're a fan of the PC Engine. So you can check that out and the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. And with our friends at PCBWay. Now, if you're working on a retro project over the next couple of months, they offer a fully featured custom PCB prototype service, and they give you low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards and services like 3D printing and injection molding, and they're big supporters of the retro community. So you can get an instant quote for your project right now at PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 384, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And great to have you joining us for another Geek Out session for the next hour-ish, talking about classic video games, bringing it up to speed on what's been happening in the world of retro from over the last week. And basically, if you recognise this sound, this is the podcast for you. And we've got to say happy 25th birthday to Windows 98 that celebrated his birthday this week.
I saw Windows, yeah, they tweeted you and they actually said, oh, thanks for remembering. That was quite nice.
Quite nice from a Twitter account with, I think it was 8.5 million followers. So if maybe you've discovered us through that, welcome to the show. This is what we do every Friday. A little roundtable chat about what's been happening in retro over the last week. So, we save you the effort of Googling around and all that stuff. We do it for you. And then we bring you an interview in the second half of the podcast. And my word, have we got a good one this week.
Oh, I love it when we get pioneers on and people that, we've wanted to have on the podcast since day one. And Dan, you've absolutely smashed it with this week's guest.
Now, this is Tod Frye, who he was a man who was behind Atari's biggest selling cartridge for the 2600. And it wasn't a game that was without any controversy because he actually did the home port of Pac-Man. Now, have you guys played the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man before?
I haven't played it, but I've seen it. It's got like the blue background, hasn't it? With like, I know exactly which one it is. Quite a bit of a controversial one, wasn't it?
Yeah, because it wasn't, obviously it was very different to the arcade version, and there was kind of the flickering graphics were the thing that most people complained about back then. But actually when we hear kind of Todd's design decisions about it, it goes really in depth into kind of why he went down that path back in the day, and also what he might have done differently if he could kind of do it all again, and actually what he might do differently. He's got some plans of maybe redoing that at some stage, no spoilers in there. But obviously the other big thing he's known for, and we definitely spend the other half of the interview talking about this, is the legendary Swordquest series. Now, anyone that is a fan of Angry Video Game Nerd, I'm sure has watched that video that he did a few years ago. I think that's definitely up there in my top 5 AVGN videos, the Swordquest one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it could actually be my favourite episode, actually. Not just because of like the production of it and the music in there and everything like that, but the actual story of Swordquest and like kind of like the rise and fall of it, and with the, well, I say 4 games, inverted commas and everything like that, and kind of like what happened with the prizes and stuff like that is a really interesting story. So kind of like, do you guys kind of get the inside story from Tod then with that?
Yeah, we do, but we also talk about like, the kind of pioneering days as well, those early days with mainframes and Berkeley, and I kind of love hearing about the early days of Atari and stuff. It's really fantastic because this is like the foundation of our video games world. So it's so good to get him on.
Yeah, we definitely do talk a lot about Swordquest in here as well. Because, for those who aren't familiar, it was a really interesting concept. It was in the early 80s. It was produced by Atari. It was meant to be a contest where there was 3 finished games, Earthworld, Fireworld, and Waterworld. And then there's meant to be a 4th game called Airworld that obviously that never got released back in the day. There was, the video game crash and it kind of never happened. But you're right, Joe, the really interesting thing about that was there was real life prizes for people who could solve the puzzles, wasn't there? And these were proper treasures. There was like a sword and a chalice and
crown
these
and
were
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, diamond encrusted and rubies and stuff on them. Worth a lot of money. And a couple of them were given out. And actually, we talked to Tod about kind of the whereabouts of them today. But the one that everyone kind of talks about is, what happened to that last prize, the sword? And there's all these rumours that, Jack Tramiel, who took over Atari, people said they spotted it kind of mounted above his fireplace in his house. And then when Jack passed away a few years ago, and a lot of people were asking, well, has anyone found the sword of sorcery, I believe it was called? It's never turned up. So we kind of get some of Todd's kind of thoughts on that and what may have happened to those. But also, interestingly, last year, as part of the Atari 50 celebrations, there was a version of that fourth game, Airworld, that was released. So we found out a bit more from Tod about kind of, was he involved in that? Was that kind of his vision, and really go in depth into all that. So it's really interesting. And I think, whenever we cover stuff that really became a video game urban legend, it's always nice to kind of hear these stories, particularly ones that have been going around for 40 years now, to kind of get it from the horse's mouth and find out exactly what happened. So a really, really interesting chat. I know you're going to love this one. Tod Frye, the Atari superstar, is going to be our special guest, and he'll be on the podcast in around half an hour from now. Now, lots of news stories that have been making the headlines this week, including, this one is particularly exciting because I must admit this is not a game I've played before, because we didn't actually get this back in the day, did we? This is the Super Mario RPG that Nintendo have announced a massive HD remake for the Nintendo Switch.
Yeah, man, this I'm really excited for this. So you are right, Mario RPG, Super Mario RPG. We didn't get it in Europe back in the day. It came out on Super Nintendo in America and Japan in 1996. So really late, kind of like in the Super Nintendo kind of run, kind of on the cusp of the N64 coming out, or even as the N64 came out in Japan. And obviously PlayStation and Sega Saturn had been out for a while by that point. But, we were still getting some Super Nintendo games, some late games and some late Mega Drive games and stuff like that. But just some of them just didn't come out over in Europe or, kind of had limited releases and stuff like that. But, Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars, really, really, really big game in America and Japan. And really great to see it getting some love because there has been ways to play it, in the UK in the past, obviously other than emulation with like the Virtual Console and the Wii U Virtual Console, and it was also on the Super Nintendo Mini. But yeah, it's getting, the HD remaster remake, which is going to be coming to the Switch on 17th of November this year. So we've not got to wait too long for it, only 4 or 5 months.
They've timed that well, haven't they? They know everyone's going to be thinking, what can I get my Christmas stocking this year?
Yeah, absolutely. And off the back of the success of the Super Mario movie as well, it's cool to see Nintendo Direct, doing all these new Mario games that are coming, and there's the Peach game as well, which just makes complete sense. But yeah, Super Mario.
Is this kind of like a Final Fantasy style RPG?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that. So yeah, Super Mario RPG, it was it's kind of like a gateway into Japanese kind of RPGs, JRPGs. It's a turn-based RPG, very similar to early Final Fantasy games, kind of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you use magic and you take it in turns to attack each other, and you have a party of 3, and then you're fighting monsters and stuff like that. Really enjoyed it when I played it on emulation as a teenager. Can't remember the exact story, but I remember, you get Peach and Bowser in your party, and you can, Bowser's, kind of a good guy, if you will, because there's a greater enemy, so you have to team up with him, and you can use him as a character and stuff like that, which is really fun. And really loving that in the remake, they've kind of kept the chibi style graphics, like, Mario's quite a little stumpy Mario, and I think he looks fantastic. Yeah, with a big head. I think it looks really, really good. And also, they've actually got some of the original, developers working on it, which I think is really cool. The original composer has announced that she's going to be returning to compose on the remake as well. Yoko Shiramura, I think her name is. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, which is really cool. And what's quite interesting as well, as you said, Dan, it's Super Mario RPG, the original, was it was a partnership between Nintendo and Square. Now Square Enix, who did the Final Fantasy games, and I didn't see their logo anywhere kind of in the trailer prominently, but they are at the bottom, kind of like running across, the bottom of the screen at the end of the trailer, that they are involved. So I don't know if it's just a case of like licensing, or if they've actually, are supporting in the development of the game, but either way, it's cool.
It's weird because I've played some RPGs and stuff, and I do like playing them on, the big screen and stuff, but they seem to fit well on a handheld or a portable console, and just having this on the Switch is just going to be really nice. I've always kind of thought I want to replay Final Fantasy and sit down with a Switch and kind of go through it,
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And if you're not too keen on RPGs or familiar with them, I think this is definitely going to be a good kind of way to get into them, or even just experience it and just play it and just oh yeah, I played that RPG, I enjoyed that. One thing that was in the original, which I'm really hoping is going to be in the remake, there is a secret boss, an interdimensional demon in the original called Kulex, who's actually, I believe, from a Final Fantasy game, one of the earlier ones, who you could fight in the original RPG, and he's really out of place. He's really out of place in Super Mario RPG because he's like a big demon with sprite artwork of Final Fantasy, whereas
everything else is all cute and
everything else is all cute and squishy, and then it's like that silicon graphics kind of style, very similar to Donkey Kong, and he's just like this big pixelated monster. I think it would be wicked if he's in the remake, or even if it's just a well-known Final Fantasy boss in the remake as a hidden boss would be fantastic.
And it looks like there's loads of little mini games in there and stuff. And as you're kind of exploring the world, you're doing different things. And I love the pace of, turn-based games as well, actually. It does make you relax a bit more and just kind of get really into it and invest in the world. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's not like it's hard to describe. Some RPGs, they get into the as you level up, your attacks start doing thousands of millions of damage, and bosses have 10 million HP. It's all quite nice and steady. Everybody's got a couple of hundred HP, and every attack does a couple of hundred of attack and stuff like that. It's all very, it's nice and it's simple. And I think Nintendo will probably keep it that way for the remake, and they know what they're doing.
Yeah, and kind of watching this as well, something that, I'm not all that familiar with the RPG genre. I know this kind of inspired Paper Mario, which I've played that briefly, and Mario and Luigi as well. But the fact that it's kind of got that humour in there as well, which, you don't often see in a lot of these kind of games from what I've seen.
Yeah.
Which I think is definitely a nice little bonus, something that makes it a bit more friendly to people who aren't. It does feel like a genre to me where there are people that are really hardcore into JRPGs, and it doesn't always feel the most welcoming genre for newcomers.
Yeah,
so I think, it can help with that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even myself, I wouldn't say I'm the biggest RPG guy, but I used to love them, and now trying to get into kind of more modern ones and stuff, I do struggle because so many of them are so far along in their sequels and stuff like that, like Fire Emblem. I mean, Final Fantasy you can kind of pick up because it's always a different kind of a new story, but yeah, sometimes I get a bit overwhelmed with how many are out there now.
It's all about the stats and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Mario RPG keeps it simple. I recommend it, absolutely.
Yeah, I know a lot of people have been kind of hoping that the original would come to the Nintendo Switch Online, the Super Nintendo games, but actually it looks like they're getting spoiled rotten because they're doing a full HD remaster of it as well. So that's going to be coming out in time for Christmas this year in November. So if you want to check out the trailer, it looks absolutely beautiful. I'll put that in our show notes, and the rest of the stories at theretrohour.com. Now, Joe, you like to think your Mega Drive, your Sega Genesis quite well?
Yeah, quite familiar with them.
What about this? Have you ever seen a white Sega Mega Drive before?
I haven't. I've seen Ravi's white Game Gear.
Yeah, that was a developer's one, so there were only 10,000 of those made. And I think for some reason they kind of made the developers' ones white, but they were pretty much in Japan only.
Yeah, and they're super rare, 10,000, like you say. But apparently, there's no apparently about it. It's true. There was a white Sega Mega Drive, Sega Genesis, and there was 2 of them made. And they've kind of, I want to say surfaced this week, but they haven't surfaced. They've been spotted in a documentary which has got footage from 1992, hasn't it?
It's a basketball documentary. And, I've been watching a lot of basketball documentaries, actually. And the footage is so good because all of that stuff was massively documented, and you see the technology at the times. They zoom into old CRT TVs and stuff. There's one I recommend called The Last Dance, which is just absolutely amazing. I think it was on Netflix. But just even for the kind of nostalgia, I wasn't into basketball back in the days, but just seeing the kind of association with like games as well, NBA Jam and stuff. There was a huge kind of connection with basketball and gaming.
Yeah.
Well, it's a new documentary that's been made about the former San Antonio Spurs basketball player David Robinson. But you're right, it has got footage in there of him playing Sega Genesis back in 1992. Now, this was picked up from a Twitter user called Console Variations, so, by the name, I imagine looks for, rare different versions of consoles, who spotted this white Sega Genesis / Mega Drive, as we call it over here, and he basically freaked out and was like, what the hell is this? Does anyone know what this is? Give us a story behind this console. And then a few people replied, including a guy called Don Transeth. Now, turns out that Don is the former vice president of sports marketing and brand innovation at EA, and he was one of the guys that launched the EA Sports brand back in the day. So I managed to get hold of him, and he explained a bit about kind of what was going on. Obviously, back then, they really wanted to get associated with professional sports, and they became the official video game supplier of the American team because obviously they were the exclusive NBA game. So what they did is actually set up a gaming lounge in the players' hotel. So they got a lot of the players around to basically play the game on a Genesis. Yeah. So what they did is make a custom console just so it'd stand out, really. And it turned out they made their own white version of it. Now, the way they did this sounds quite interesting because it said that they tried to use just regular paint.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know if you guys have tried that. It never really looks all that good. I remember trying to paint an Amiga back in the day and it just looked...
Yeah, it's because it's like the plastic that the consoles were kind of made out of. They just don't take well to it, do they, at all? But yeah, really interesting because they ended up using car paint, didn't they? Like Chevrolet Corvette paint that just took to it really well.
And apparently it looked really nice. And they made two of those, and they also put a Team USA basketball sticker on the console as well to make it look official. Like I said, they made two of these. The only thing is, obviously, the next question is, what happened to them?
I think they look really cool because they've kept all the buttons on there black. Well.
I like
so
that.
It's kind of got that nice like black and white contrast, and it does feel like EA, a white Mega Drive.
Yeah, it's what I like about it is it's kind of like because when the EA games first came out, they were like the black and yellow boxes, but then as you kind of started to get to 92, 93, and especially as FIFA was coming out and stuff like that, they kind of started putting the games out in the white boxes, and the EA branding became that like white logo with the the blue E and the red A. It kind of moved away from the old Electronic Arts, with the square, the circle and the square and the triangle. I think it was yellow, purple, and green. And by that point, they're moving to that white branding that I think they still use to this day. So I think the white Mega Drive with the black buttons, like you say, Ravi, I think it just looks slick and it suited it really well.
I'm hoping that this is going to turn up in like EA's archives. I hope it's still in there somewhere, or maybe a former employee is going to be like, actually, I think I might have seen that in my attic, and there's going to be a bit of a hunt for it now. Or
it'll turn up at a car boot sale. As they always seem to.
Or you're spotted in CEX next week for like £200,000 or something. Does look very cool though, and actually, I think maybe it's going to cause a few people to be like, actually, maybe I'll make my own version of the white Mega Drive. It's quite simple to make.
We're in a world where the Nintendo PlayStation can actually be found. So, this isn't beyond the realms of possibility.
Hope is out there. Now, one thing we're going to talk about with our guest, Tod Frye, in just a moment, well, we actually get into like the early days of microcomputers, and we're talking about stuff like, the Altera and stuff like that. Obviously, back then, in the late 70s, and even in the early 80s, with stuff like the ZX80, over here in the UK, it was quite a common thing to buy a kit computer. Now, these were machines that, instead of buying them fully assembled from Dixon's or somewhere like that, you'd actually send off, mail order, they'd ship you a box full of the parts, and then you'd have to solder and put them together yourself.
Oh, a lot of the early micros were like that, weren't they? They were just kind of kit computers.
And I don't know about you, Ravi, but I've always kind of looked back on that a bit kind of with a bit of a warm glow, thinking, because that's kind of that hobbyist thing, isn't it? So I remember being at school and building, like kind of Morse code transmitters and little radios at
like
stuff like that.
When I was growing up, I used to have a little electronics kit, and quite a few people did actually. And
I still got scars from soldering irons on my fingers. I think
you'd have hundreds of projects, and I don't know if you can hear an ice cream van driving by in the background.
We can, yeah.
It's a sunny day here, but it's just absolutely cool to do, and something that I would try and attempt these days because I've had a bit more soldering experience. I was always kind of worried about ruining kit and kind of playing stuff. But this kind of looks absolutely fantastic. So this is the Micro Beast, which is
love the name.
Yeah, by a company called Fearsome, and just kind of spotted this online, and I thought, what a good project to either do yourself or, you know, even do with the kids. You know, maybe you do the soldering, they kind of pick the parts and talk about it. And it's quite a small little kind of self-contained unit, and what it does is it runs CPM. So you can have it connected by USB-C, which is really cool. So it can get the power, and then you can have it connected by USB, and it works through the communication. So you can have the comms on a PC. Talk,
like a terminal.
Yeah, talk to the machine through the terminal. There's like a really nice display over the top, and I quite like the keyboard as well. It looks really clicky. And
that's the thing. Back in the day, stuff like the ZX80, they had those kind of, you know, dead flesh kind of chiclet kind of keyboards, didn't they? But this looks like it's got, you know, some key travel there by the looks of it. You know, it does look a lot better
and
than
it's one man who's doing this project, and it's pretty good. So the orders are limited at the moment because you know, he's creating them himself, but you do get this whole self-contained 8-bit computer, and it's 190 pounds at the moment, which I think is quite reasonable for something like this, you know, where you've got lots of custom components, and it also comes from a legacy of like older computers, like these little homebrew computers and kits. The RC 2014 was one that we've mentioned on the show before, and there's a lot of stuff that's kind of compatible with that as well. What do you think of it, Dan?
I think this is really interesting because, I mean, I've seen several of these around, you know, similar kind of projects, but generally, and they kind of mentioned this on this article on Hackster.io that I'll link up in the show notes that tells you all about this project. Most of these kind of mini kit computers these days rely on either ARM-based processors or they kind of just, you know, emulate old hardware. But actually, this device here, the Micro Beast by a guy called Andy Toon, the thing that's really interesting about this is it's actually got a real Z80 processor.
Yeah, very popular processor, and that's actually running at 8 to 10 megahertz, which is pretty good. And it seems that he's developed the core. So he's got the hardware there, that's been developed, that's kind of out there, and he's developing the core, but he's also developing an emulator at the same time. So you'll be able to, you know, develop software and then kind of fire it onto the machine. And I kind of like the idea of having terminal in this smaller little display, but I wonder what's going to come out of this. Like, are we going to see, you know, custom cases? It's quite a thin profile like device. Are we going to see custom screens and all sorts coming out of this? So I think it's got a really good idea and a lot of future.
It measures, it's really small actually, 235 by 160 by 35 millimeters. You've got a 47-key keyboard in there as well with a unique 24-character display with 14 segment elements. So it looks really interesting, the design goals of it. One thing that he's mentioned is, and I think this is a really good thing about this, is, you know, we've had the component shortage for a couple of years now. One of his design goals is to pick only currently manufactured and available components.
That's
so
smart.
Hopefully he's not going to kind of run out. Yeah.
Now I've got a question. Is this something that you would try to attempt?
I must admit, I mean, I haven't done a hell of a lot of soldering.
I thought you bought all the kit, Dan.
I did buy all the kit, but I haven't used it. I've done kind of some through-hole soldering. I'm getting better at it, though. I mean, you know, I had like a solder sucker before, but I've kind of got into, you know, using solder braid and that kind of thing. I think maybe, you know, the price, I get the price is probably what it needs to be for something kind of custom like this now, but maybe £190 is just a bit much for something that I've probably got a I was going to say 50%, maybe an 80% chance of actually ruining. So maybe I'll practice on something.
Yeah, I think it's nice because it's a computer. You're still using a computer, but also it's kind of like you're away from a screen. You're just focusing on that task, and you're doing something with your hands, which I think is really cool. So it looks like a great little project, and I hope he doesn't get overwhelmed with the amount of orders and stuff because they seem to be limited. But I think this is going to be very popular.
Yeah, and I think just the satisfaction of having built your own computer, you know, from components, I think that's
exactly
really cool. So,
yeah. I built this.
If you want to get hold of one of those, like you said, hopefully we don't overwhelm him, but we'll put a link in the show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, there has been a long tradition, and particularly over the last kind of few generations of consoles, probably going back to maybe even the PS2, that often console manufacturers would sell consoles at a loss, and they would make the money back not on hardware but on software licenses. It's kind of been a model that a lot of them have followed. I don't think Nintendo do, but I know definitely it's been the way with Xbox and Sony over the last few generations. This is an article about console wars, and there's a document that was submitted in June 22nd in a court hearing by Microsoft. And obviously, there's always been these, the tussles between various gaming companies. Back in the day, it was, Sega versus Nintendo. Last 20 years or so, it's been Sega, Microsoft, and Nintendo. But obviously, there's been, all these cases recently of Microsoft buying companies and all these rumors that, they kind of want to put Sony out of business and all that too. But actually, it turns out in this this document that's been submitted to the court hearing, it turns out that Microsoft have admitted that they've actually really, really lost the console war to Nintendo and Sony ever since it entered the scene with the original Xbox back in 2001. And they're saying, even the GameCube, and particularly the PS2, absolutely trounced Xbox by a significant margin. And they admit that, look, we've lost the console wars and their rivals are positioned to continue dominating.
It feels so defeated. Reading it, it feels like
we've got no hope.
We've got no hope. But the thing is, they're not giving up. Kind of reading the article, it's a little bit like mixed emotions for me. There's been all these kind of leaked documents and rumors that the next Xbox is expected in 2028. So they're not bowing out of the console war or anything like that. It just feels really kind of underwhelming. But then in the same respect, it's just I get, they often sell at a loss and stuff like that. But they're pretty much saying that they hold 21% of the market, which, sounds relatively low compared to PlayStation and Nintendo, who I can only assume own, the other kind of 40% each. I think they're pretty much, it's kind of saying that they're kind of equals. There might be 1% elsewhere with, other off brands and stuff like that, or even probably less than 1%. But it's it's 21%, but it's 21% of the biggest media in the world. Video games is bigger than Hollywood. It's huge. Do you know what I mean? So that's still billions upon billions of pounds or dollars or whatever, that they've got that 21% stake in. And it just, I don't know. It just feels really underwhelming for me. And I get it. It's you're in third place and PlayStation and Nintendo are just crushing you. And I think a lot of it could be because Xbox have got such a small market in Japan, and obviously Japan is such a huge cultural, video games is such a big thing for them. I think that's probably where they're kind of falling down. But I was surprised to see that they were third in the 6th generation with GameCube and PlayStation, because I could be wrong. I thought the Xbox outsold the GameCube, and maybe it did. Maybe now I'm saying it out loud, and it's probably because of the Game Boy Advance and stuff. Nintendo have got that market share because they've got their handhelds and stuff like that, whereas Xbox doesn't have that. Because I'm sure the Xbox outsold the GameCube. People might be screaming at me right now.
Kind of talking about a market here, which is 3 dominant companies in it, and stuff like the Evercade is not going to have a even a close percentage near any of them. Whereas
the Atari VCS, the new one.
Whereas you go back in the days and you'd have stuff like the 3DO out, and you'd have tons of machines and CDI and all of this. And I really wonder what the kind of percentages of those ones would have been, and what would be seen as a success. I don't know, is Microsoft kind of saying, we've only sold this many units?
Well,
and it's...
Yeah, they are. So they say since the PS5 and Xbox Series X came out, the Series X/S has sold 21 million units only. It's only sold 21 million units. And the PlayStation 5 has sold 36 million. It says the Switch has sold 36 million as well, but I'm sure the Switch has actually sold 100 million.
Don't mention the Wii U to Ravi.
Yeah.
13 million.
Oh, wow, 13 million. But it's it sold 21 million. I'll compare it to PlayStation, which has sold 36 million. Yeah, that's a massive gap. But it's not like the gap of, as you've just said, the Wii U compared to the PS4 or the Dreamcast compared to the PS2, where the Dreamcast was a couple of million? And the PS2 was 200 million.
You've got
that's you're defeated. That's like, yeah, okay, we're bowing out. See you later. Sega's, packing.
And then
the
if
bags.
you think of the whole handheld market that they had as well, you had stuff like the Wonder Swan in there as well, and that's only 3.5 million, and it's kind of interesting to see that like this kind of battle for the ground, because it is just dominated by 3 companies now, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I also think this can change as well. I mean, we look back at the 7th generation. The Xbox 360 was clearly in the lead, wasn't it, for most of that generation?
Yeah.
And I'm looking at in the total sales for that, 360 sold 84 million units. But then at the end of that generation, the PS3 just overtook it, and that sold 87 million in the end.
Yeah, but what did the Wii do? Like 160 million?
Yeah, I mean, the Wii was by far the biggest of that generation, but I think in terms of Xbox versus PlayStation, it looked like the 360 was going to, until like probably the final 2 years of that generation, which was a long one. That was like a 8-9 year generation.
Yeah.
So it can change, and that's the thing. But I mean, I'm reading this article, and to me, it does kind of sound like Microsoft is saying. So I mean, the whole reason this has come about is because obviously of their acquisition of Activision, and Sony are basically saying that they still want to get Call of Duty. That's where this has all kind of come from. If Microsoft own Activision Blizzard, then they're worried that they might not get one of the lead selling games on the platform. But I think to me, it just kind of sounds like Microsoft are kind of saying that, look, we don't really want to be all that much in the console market anymore, and this is a reason they want to kind of go down that, a digital service provider.
Well, there's
route,
they're also
like a Netflix of a game.
They've also got like back in the days you had a definition between the Xbox and the PlayStation, whereas now they play a lot of titles that the other one plays, and it's just, there's a bit of a graphical definition. Of course, there's exclusives and stuff, but then you look at the Switch, and that's just totally Nintendo and totally different to the other two. So maybe it's more of a kind of battle between Sony and Microsoft that this is about.
And that's the thing. I mean, generally the prices tend to come down of the hardware as well. You get like, slim versions of consoles and stuff as well. And I did read a rumor that apparently there might be, and this must have been a joke, a PlayStation 5 Pro. There was like kind of a mock-up image of that I saw the other day online that was like double the size. I thought, I could put that in my room, actually. It's scrape along the ceiling.
The Xbox Series X Pro, it's as big as your fridge freezer.
So interesting to hear that Microsoft have basically said, look, since 2001, we know we've been the underdog. But yeah, I don't think they're doing too bad, are they? So interesting little read if you want to check that out. Now, before we get into our chat with Tod Frye, he's coming up in just a moment. This is always really exciting, particularly for you, Joe, because I know you love your Mega Drive, as we mentioned. I know you love Metroid as well. Now, this turns out this is an unofficial version of Metroid Mega Mission for the Sega Mega Drive. Yeah,
Metroid Mega Mission. This is a fan project that's kind of coming off the back of, we've covered a few of these. It's Mega Final Fight, which was an arcade port of Final Fight to the Mega Drive, which was fantastic. There was a Mega Drive version of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which, was quite a bit of a dumbed down version, but graphically it looked fantastic compared to the PlayStation version. But yeah, this is Metroid Mega Mission for Sega Mega Drive, which comes from a guy called Genesis 814, which looks really cool. It's in its early kind of days at the moment, and it's just an early demo, but graphically and kind of like the playability of it looks really, really, really close to the Super Nintendo version. And really kind of like, obviously we've got like HD screens and stuff like that now, but like the definition of it looks fantastic. Samus seems to play a little bit heavy compared to the original, in my opinion. She seems a bit weighty, not quite as floaty. But like I say, really early demo here. And then there isn't any enemies or anything like that in the demo yet. But at the moment, it is just a kind of 2-3 minute clip. But, definitely want to kind of, for us to keep an eye on and see when this might drop and see if it actually runs on Mega Drive, through EverDrives, etc.
I love the look of it, though. Yeah, I think I haven't played this game before. It kind of reminds me of something you might have got on the Game Boy Advance or something like that.
Yeah, there was a
look of it.
Yeah, there was a few Metroid games for the Game Boy Advance, and that's actually a really good comparison, actually, because of color-wise, palette-wise. I think the Game Boy Advance, Metroid Fusion, and I forget what the other one was called. They probably edged out graphically the Super Nintendo version of Super Metroid. And yeah, I think the palette of this kind of probably a little bit more on par with those versions, a little bit more colourful than the Super Nintendo version. But yeah, if to actually see this run on a Mega Drive, maybe a couple of months down the line, will be stunning. But yeah, like I said, the only thing putting me off it is just the kind of weightiness of it when you jump around
He
and
looks
stuff.
fast, like really quick. The animation of the character, maybe a bit too quick.
Yeah, maybe. But the Metroid games are kind of quick games. They're not like that slow, methodical kind of games. They, it looks about the right speed for those kind of, the old 16-bit. I think
it's a jump animation to me that kind of looks a bit stuttery.
Yeah.
But, I mean, like you said, this is like, I imagine not even an alpha version. It's just literally a 2-minute demo of what could be. So they're getting the engine down first, and I imagine kind of those finishing touches, and hopefully the rest of the game will follow. I mean, we don't really know much about this, whether it's getting a full release or how it's going to be coming out, if it even is. It might just be someone showing off kind of what they can do. But I think it is quite interesting to see. It's always cool when you see kind of what were originally console exclusives coming out on their rivals, isn't it? Yeah, very cool. If you want to check that out, I'll put that and everything else we talk about, you can see it in our show notes. You don't have to Google around, have a look on your podcast app, or head to our website at theretrohour.com. Now, before we get into our chat with Tod Frye, he's coming up in just a moment, going inside the world of Atari back in the day, talking about their biggest selling title, Pac-Man, of course, and the legendary Swordquest series. Let's take a moment to give a big thank you to our longest-running sponsor. Come on, guys, let's show some love to Bitmap Books. How much do we love Bitmap Books? But I think it is quite interesting to see. It's always cool when you see kind of what were originally console exclusives coming out on their rivals, isn't it? I think that is a really exciting bit for me. It'd be like kind of seeing, like a Sonic game on a Super Nintendo or something like that. So, yeah, very cool. If you want to check that out, I'll put that and everything else we talk about, you can see it in our show notes. You don't have to Google around, have a look on your podcast app, or head to our website at theretrohour.com. Now, before we get into our chat with Tod Frye, he's coming up in just a moment, going inside the world of Atari back in the day, talking about their biggest selling title, Pac-Man, of course, and the legendary Swordquest series. Let's take a moment to give a big thank you to our longest-running sponsor. Come on, guys, let's show some love to Bitmap Books. How much do we love Bitmap Books?
We adore Bitmap Books. I can't actually wait to meet up with some of the guys this weekend as well, because I absolutely love Bitmap Books, and they've been a huge supporter of the Retro Hour for a good couple of years now, good few years.
Yeah, they're going to be selling books at Ravi's event this weekend. Kickstarter, if you're coming along. Definitely check out their store there. And one of their books as well that I was chatting to Sam, and he's really proud of this one. Now, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the PC Engine. Have you ever played one before?
I do like the PC Engine. I've got the PC Engine Mini, and there's some wicked kind of exclusive PC Engine games, some exclusive Castlevania. Well, there's a Castlevania game on there. The Bonk games are really, really good. Splatterhouse, which is an absolutely stunning game if you're into horror and kind of Evil Dead and stuff like that. All have really, really awesome graphics. PC Engine's a funny one. Is it 8-bit? Is it 16-bit? But I think it's got a real distinct kind of graphical pixel look to it, which I absolutely love.
And this book is celebrating the box art of PC Engine titles. And looking at these, they're absolutely stunning. I mean, obviously it was a big console, particularly in Japan, by NEC, and I think particularly for us this side of the pond where it wasn't all that popular, it's quite interesting to kind of look at what was happening around the other side of the world. And in Japan it was really part of a movement. It was that this aesthetic image that emerged in Japan that very soon would spread across the world, influencing art, design and creativity. And it is a real look at kind of what the company's games and movies and music and design and fashion, all of that in Japan that was going off at that time influenced each other. And you look at some of the box art of these games, and these in themselves are works of art. They're absolutely gorgeous, really vibrant. And this book actually celebrates all the diversity and the sophistication and the personality behind some of the most interesting Japanese releases for the PC Engine. Now you've got, some of the games you mentioned there, also Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, you've got Devil Crash Bomberman, which I think Bomberman 93, that was originally a PC Engine exclusive when it first came out. And there is 300 professionally shot pieces of box art in here, spanning over 372 pages. Now, if you've ever seen a Bitmap book before, they really lead on the design, don't they? And they are by far the highest quality, most beautiful retro gaming books.
Oh yeah, they're absolutely beautiful. The quality on them is like, they're the nice big coffee table books, and they've got some proper weight to them. But yeah, just every kind of like detail and aspect to them is just absolutely beautiful. And there's no kind of like blurring or smudge there. With any of the artwork, it's displayed kind of just beautiful.
Yeah, and actually the cover of this, since I saw this, it really stood out to me. It's an exclusive cover by Will Overton from Rare and Superplay magazine back in the day. And this is now a new collector's edition. So if you're interested in the PC Engine and you want this real celebration of the system and its amazing titles back in the day, this collector's edition is limited to only 2,000 copies, and it will never, ever be printed again, ever. Oh, wow. So if you want to get hold of this, I'd recommend that you do it right now. I'll link that up and check out the rest of their retro gaming books as well. They've done so many over the years. And a massive thank you to our friends at Bitmap Books. Their website is bitmapbooks.com, and a big thanks to Sam and the team for their continued support of our little show. Now, Tod Frye, our special guest, is coming up in just a second. First of all, just a quick mention that, we do have a patron that helps us keep the lights on here at Retro Hour Towers, and helps us bring the podcast out to you every single Friday. But we're not all take. In fact, we have a wonderful community around this podcast. So if you join, you'll become part of, and you'll get invited to, definitely our highlight of the month. Usually last Sunday of the month is when we do our patrons hangout. Now, we do at least one of these a month, actually 2 last month, where we all get together, couple of hours, we hang out, and literally anything goes, isn't it? Anything retro, anything geeky. I'm trying to think of some of the topics we were talking about on last weekend's hangout. It was all over, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was interesting because we were talking about TV advertising, but also like magazine advertising for some of the older consoles, stuff like the PlayStation adverts when they came out, but also like the Dreamcast ad campaigns as well, and some of the more controversial adverts that came out as well and got pulled off TV when they were trying to get, risque and get to that like younger generation and the cool teenagers and all of that.
We even talked about when you've been tango, which got banned at my school because it was a thing in the UK called the happy slap, where then kids would like slap around the ears, and I remember everyone getting detention for trying.
Did you have red ears for a long time?
Orange ears.
And we were on about hacking cable boxes and American cable and the difference between cable with the American system and the UK. It was really interesting.
Yeah, back in the day when you'd slip your cable engineer 20 quid to enable a few extra channels for you. So that's what we talk, all kinds of things. A lot of retro gaming talk as well, obviously. And this is something we do once a month. So if you'd like to get invited to the July Hangout, now would be a very good time to join us on Patreon. And also you will unlock, if you join us as a gold member or above, 36 episodes it will be. So we're recording a new one next week of our bonus exclusive podcast, The Retro Hour After Hours. And lots of extra stuff. You get an episode that's longer of this normal podcast every week. You get about 15 minutes of extra news, and we take all the adverts out as well. So really good to join us on Patreon. You help support the podcast. And of course, we do welcome in our new inductees each week into the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, and that is the Retro Hour Hall of Fame. And I'll let you guys induct our latest members.
Hall of Fame.
Who we got?
Joe.
And Lee Mintram.
No relation there, Joe. This is a different Joe. But yeah, thank you so much for your support, Joe and Lee Mintram, who joined us on Patreon over the last week. And if you'd like to join the Retro Hours Patreon community, all the details are at theretrohour.com. Right, then next on the show, we're going to be going inside the world of Atari, talking about Pac-Man, that controversial home port, the legendary Swordquest series, with our special guest, Tod Frye. He's next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time to welcome on this week's very special guest. And today it is our pleasure to welcome on a true legend of the industry, known for the best-selling Atari 2600 game of all time, and also the legendary Swordquest series as well. Let's welcome on our guest this week, Tod Frye. How's it going, Tod?
It's going well. How are y'all?
Yeah, very good, thank you. And we're really, really excited to hear some stories about Atari. I mean, we've had many Atari people on the podcast in previous years. Good Nolan Bushnell, we had him on for our 100th episode. And obviously, the most legendary gaming company. So it's always wonderful to hear some inside baseball talk, as it were. But I mean, before we get into all that, it's always interesting to kind of find out a bit of background on our guests. I mean, you personally, do you remember what kind of got you into this whole thing? What was your first ever computer experience? Where did it all start?
I took a course, an after-school course, when I was 13, in once a week in Fortran programming, Portland Junior High School here in El Cerrito, California. And it was amusing to me because we didn't have access to a computer. So the teacher provided us with these forms, these templates for punch cards. We'd write the Fortran program out, and he would take it home and come back the next week and tell us whether it worked or not. Not because he'd run it, but just because he'd done the bench check. That was my very first exposure to computers, actually using them. And I'm a mathy kind of a nerd. And I just call that out as 1969. But my family moved to Berkeley in 1971. And, in 71. And I took a computer programming course, which was punched cards and Fortran. And I fell in love, or vice versa. Computers may have just zombified me. I've been a computer freak, PHREAKE, ever since. I just love programming computers.
Well, Berkeley was an interesting place back then. It was kind of on the cutting edge. And what kind of access did you have to mainframes and systems?
Oh, well, that's therein lies. So Berkeley High School was, most of my friends had parents who were professors at Cal. And my father wasn't a professor at Cal, and there was a facility. So we started out punching cards, wrapping a rubber band about them, put them in a box, and the teacher would drive them down to the local computer center, to the school district administration center, and run the programs overnight. Come back the next day. But then Berkeley bought a little mini computer, a Wang 3300 that could do BASIC right there. And then there was a person who was the head of the local Forest Service Computer Center. His son was a senior at Berkeley High, and he got major local computer centers to donate computer time to Berkeley High. So we had access to no one has ever heard of the UNIVAC, SS90. No, not the SS90. That was a different thing. Supercomputers, literally. Through remote batch, I had access to the same supercomputers that the federal government had, basically. That's Lawrence Berkeley Labs, mostly. For the CDC 7600s they had. I think they had two 6600s and a 7600. So it was, I had access to the most powerful computers in the world, basically, when I was at Berkeley High.
Were there any games being played on those machines at the time, or was it mainly used for research?
Not really. I mean, first off, my friend Ian Shepard, who was the person who got me to Atari, 8 years later, and mostly he, wrote a little computer game up at Lawrence Berkeley that was like a little robot combat game. But mostly it was just punched cards. So back then, mostly you didn't have real-time access to computers. It was mostly, this is not entirely true, but there were not much by way of games. I mean, you'd punch your cards, you'd wrap a rubber band around them, you'd put them in an input queue, you'd come back an hour later, you'd have a printout. I guess you could have played, so no, there were no games then. Well, so then we got access to a computer, time-shared computer system at Berkeley High, and my friend Andy Fuchs and I wrote a kind of a text-based adventure game. It was about, so this was 72 in Berkeley. It was about buying and selling illicit drugs and the cost of getting caught and how much it cost to smuggle and how much stuff cost in Mexico and how much you could sell it for in Berkeley. And it was a fun little, just a huge mess of if statements.
Was that Drug Wars?
No, it was just a little private computer game that he and I wrote. It never got published. It was kind of popular among some of the students at Berkeley High. Things were very small then in terms of what was, I think Pong was being invented at the same time far away. But there weren't even that many people using computers. It's like if you had 20 people we had 3,000 students at Berkeley High. If you had 15 who even knew that computers existed, it was like a big deal.
I mean, obviously, when we got into the late 70s, the kind of microcomputer revolution happened, when systems like the Altair and the IMSI started coming along. I mean, were you aware of this, and did you get hold of your first home system?
Well, so I do remember in high school getting a data sheet for a system called the Intel 4004. And it's like, we looked at this and went, wow, this is cool. You could make a computer out of this. So then time sharing kind of became available, time shared basic systems over teletypes and the like. I did see the Altair coming along, and I wasn't really a homebrew kind of person. I did go to the Homebrew Computer Club once over at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. I don't think anyone really remotely, I don't think Apple, I don't think Wozniak and Jobs were there that day. I don't really paying attention. I got a 6502 evaluation kit called a SIM1, a KIM1. It's a keyboard input monitor -1, 6502 microprocessor evaluation board. It had 6 digits of hexadecimal display and a keypad.
And that was from Commodore, wasn't it, or MOS Technologies?
That was, I think, from MOS Technology. Commodore. So right around then, what you started to get was you were getting the CPM machines. I forget what that control process monitor. You were getting the CPM S100 cards for medium-sized small commercial home computers. But that's right when you started to see the Commodore PET, Personal Electronic Transactor. The Commodore Personal Electronic Transactor, and the Apple II. And I got involved in a computer, I'd call it a techno-hippie collective in Berkeley, where a bunch of us got together and bought an Apple II. That was probably circa 78. So that was when I started to have access to personal computers. And the Apple II was revolutionary, really.
Yeah, we spoke to so many developers, from that era who said, the Apple II changed everything and really helped kickstart their career. I guess that was the case for you as well. Let's talk about how you kind of entered the industry and kind of talk us up to what led you to join Atari then. How did that journey work?
So you go back in the Wayback Machine to like 72 when we were getting access to, we were allowed into the Forest Service Computer Center. I ended up getting an after-school job with the Forest Service when I was 16, programming in Fortran for them. I think it was more so I got a security clearance and I got a paycheck and I was making minimum $4.25 an hour, which, to a 16-year-old was not nothing. And one of the people, Larry Kaplan, who is a name in the history of computing from being one of the early people at Activision, was a Cal student who had an internship at the same computer center that I did. And my good friend Ian Shepard, who at the time that I started programming was a senior at Berkeley High when I was a sophomore, he was like the most sophisticated computer programmer at Berkeley High. I aspired to become the second most, goal I think I attained. And he also got a job. He got a job programming security systems at Lawrence Lab before he went to college. And so Larry Kaplan, Ian Shepard, Tod Frye. Larry graduated college and went off and did something and ended up at Atari. He brought his connection, got Ian an introduction to Atari, and he got hired at Atari. Now, in the meantime, I had left high school and got a job as a carpenter instead of going to college, but he got an injury, and I said, okay, I'm going to go back to programming computers. And I started looking, and Ian got me an interview at Atari, and I interviewed well and got the job. So it does go back to Berkeley High and the Computer Center. There's just a direct sequence, a linkage from me to Ian to Larry to Atari, or vice versa, from Larry to Ian to me.
What was the atmosphere like at the time then? Because we've heard tales of Atari, and you mentioned there was a kind of hippie atmosphere in the tech industry at the time. What was it like?
it was actually not just like any one thing. It was not drunken orgies in the hot tub. I've heard of that. That may have been happening. But, you know, you couldn't prove it by me. It was very sink or swim. There was like really no onboarding. And there were various cohorts. I happened to be in the, you know, pothead programmer cohort with some other people who, of course, will remain nameless because that's them. But there was also some very, very much less colorful people who were very hard work. So here's the thing about Atari. To get anything done on the kind of systems we had was in extremely difficult hard work. There were no easy tasks at Atari. There was nothing that was really simple. So there are some stories over the media, all of which are true probably, about me being stoned, being drunk, usually on off-sites. There's very little about me being, there's sprinkler lobotomy in the office later, but what it was like was really hard work. It was really hard work and some lightweight partying along. I mean, lightweight partying to me is like just being a little bit stoned a lot of the time.
Well, I guess you're working that hard. You need to let your hair down a bit, don't you?
Oh, well, you know, I called it it's like a instant vacation, you know, half-hour vacation. And so actually, let me see if I can go back and answer the question. You know, one thing that happens is I've gone back and looked at it. We have a reputation for having been like, you know, a bunch of partiers. Yeah, as if, right? That's how 60, you know, that's how you could write code that runs in just 76 cycles across a VCS scan line. Not new. It's like it was 99% hard work and 1%, for me, wild partying. Not even wild partying. 1% pharmaceutically assisted relaxation.
Well, obviously, I mean, you know, one of the biggest selling Atari 2600 game we mentioned was the home version of Pac-Man that you did. And I was interested to kind of hear what was your initial reaction to getting that job, because I did read that you actually wanted to work on the home version of Defender instead of Pac-Man. What kind of happened there?
Well, okay, so to the best of my recollection, my first project at Atari was even crazier than the Atari 2600. It was a breakout for a 32 by 32 LCD system that used the AMI S2000 chip, and the S2000 chip had 2K bytes of program store and 64 nibbles of RAM and a 4-bit ALU. And, you know, these days you might call it a microcontroller or something like that. But to me, it had an ALU, it had an instruction pointer, it had an instruction counter, it had if statements, it was a computer. It was just a very small computer. And that was heck of fun. And then I did a version of Asteroids for the Atari 400-800. And that was, it was hard. And it was my first project there. And I always go back and wish I'd done better, because I had a real effort. I'm answering your question. Had a real effort getting it. I ended up having to use medium res graphics instead of high res graphics for the Asteroids and the ship. And that was an issue with the amount of RAM I could expect a person to have. And it played fine. It looked fine. But I wish it had been better. When that was done, I think we're on to May of 1981 now. My manager at the time said, we have 2 projects that need to get done, Defender and Pac-Man. You and this other programmer are available to start projects. You guys choose between yourselves. And I was a passionate Defender player, and I had not much interest in Pac-Man. Pac-Man, Defender, you know, the games from Eugene Jarvis, Defender and Robotron at very least, were like, I consider that to be like some of the Bach sonatas of video game development. I mean, they were just genius. So I cannot give praise to Eugene Jarvis and Guess Midway at the time that is too high. It's like, I love Defender. Pac-Man, okay, but it didn't grab me. However, it was a job, and I'm a professional, believe it or not. And so I went to the other program and I said, look, I don't care, you choose. I do care, but I don't really, what's important is that I'll do whichever one you don't want to. A couple days later, he came to me and said, I don't see how you can do Pac-Man, so I'll do Defender. And so I did Pac-Man.
Well, you had quite a strict timetable on Pac-Man as well. How did that impact the war?
No, that's not actually true. I mean, so people confuse and conflate E.T. with Pac-Man. I do not remember having any explicit timeline for Pac-Man. Now, I stopped my recreational pharmaceuticals or my pharmaceutically assisted relaxation while I was on Pac-Man, actually, for whatever reason. But I do not remember any management direction about when it had to be done. Now, there may have been. Back then, games took roughly 6 months. It took roughly 6 months to write a 4K cartridge for the Atari 2600. At the time, and this is part of the whole story, the whole history, the 4K, the 8K carts weren't quite available when I started Pac-Man, and they were not considered part of the normal, inventory of possibilities. Back then the lead times were long. The lead times were, mass ROMs, ROM manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing lead times. So it was like 6 months from finishing a cartridge to shelf. I do not remember any aspect of schedule pressure. I just did it as fast as I could.
Well, one thing I'm quite interested to hear about is kind of your thought process in, that obviously it was a well-known arcade game at the time, but I mean, you did make some changes, including the two-player gameplay aspect that was kind of prioritized as well. So why did you decide to go down that route then, and what challenges did that create?
So that's interesting. So the coin-op game was two-player. Like, the coin-op game, you could start a two-player game, play until you died, and then switch to the other person. So you could have this experience that was built into the coin-op. That was normal, actually, for games. It was very common for coin-op games back then to have a kind of a two-player mode where you would kind of compete, you would kind of compete with another player turn by turn. And I actually, to the best of my recollection, never seriously considered not including that. To this day, I actually think that being able to, I didn't think of it as a solitary experience. I thought of it as playing with another person, which I endorse as a human value, actually. So I did not add two-player, but I really worked within the constraint. I never considered not doing two-player, which is really weird to go back and look at this. So when I started out looking at the Atari 2600, is basically built to do tank, to have some walls, which became the dots and the maze, and to have an enemy tank and a player tank, which becomes a Ghost and a Pac-Man. So it's really, really, really does not want to have more than two objects on the screen at once and a fixed background. And it is really strongly opposed to having 4 ghosts and a Pac-Man, just in terms of the way the hardware works. So by then, we were programming the Atari 2600 well outside of what it was designed to do. So I really, really thought hard about how to reduce the amount of flicker, because I wasn't going to be able to put. So had I insisted on putting 4 non-flickering ghosts and a Pac-Man on the screen, I would have had to make it so ghosts lived in zones, in bands, one above the other. Because you can't put 2 ghosts and a human player and a Pac-Man on the same part of the screen horizontally. So I never even seriously considered that because it's not like Pac-Man. And I'm not sure this is the right thing. I was thinking about this just the other day. It's like 40 years later, I'm still thinking about whether I should rewrite parts of the game. So I wrote a display, we call them kernels, which could handle any combination of two players above each other, below each other, passing through maze channels. It's fairly simple. If I'd done this thing where they hop to rows and you never had two ghosts on the same row, going back, I think I might have been able to get away with this, right? Because, it's not Pac-Man, but it comes to a vertical channel and jumps. And it jumps when it's clear. So other ghosts, so two, they change. Both go up, one goes down, one goes up. I'll have to think about this. If they had jumped vertically and moved smoothly horizontally, you might have been able to get away with that, and I might have been able to figure out how to do it with way less, or with no flicker. But I was trying to write a display which would only flicker the amount necessary, so that if two ghosts were down at the bottom of the screen, and one ghost was in the middle of the screen, and Pac-Man and Ghost was at the top, there would be no flicker. Only if there were three objects that wanted to be in the same horizontal region would it then start flickering. And if you put all five of them in the same horizontal region, then it would start flickering. You notice I keep on using the word flicker because I was working on that, and I have the display that did that when I started working on the algorithm that would make it so that arbitrated which ghost got displayed when. And that was a very complicated thought process for the Atari 2600. And then my boss said, wow, that is really interesting. No one has ever tried anything like that. No one had tried variable flicker before. And I went, wow, why am I doing this? This is hard. And I said, okay, that's fine. Flicker, Ghost flicker, Pac-Man doesn't, and shipped it like that. So that in truth, I've gone back and looked at it. I actually recently gave a small presentation on If Only Ida, on a algorithm that would have just not done the four ghosts flicker and the Pac-Man doesn't, but just would have said, there are two things I can draw, there are five things I want to draw. What happens if I just flicker everything on a 2/5 duty cycle? It would have been a lot less flicker, and it would have cost at least 10 bytes of RAM, I think 15 bytes of ROM, rather, and maybe 4 bits. The problem with using just 4 bits of RAM is that you have to mask it. Well, aside from the fact that I don't think there were 4 bits free, and I don't think I had 15 bytes of ROM left, I'd have to go back and do some juggling. There are other ways to manage the display, the algorithm to actually correctly allocate display slots to reduce flicker to the minimum uses a lot of RAM. The easy one uses a lot of RAM. I wouldn't have been able to do 2-player and absolute minimum flicker.
It does sound, Tod, as well, hearing this, kind of the design of it as well, and kind of the technical limitations you're up against. It does make sense now. But I mean, at the time, I know some of the reviews did give it a bit of criticism that it was quite different to the arcade version. I mean, how did you kind of handle that at the time?
Well, okay, so Atari had a rule. Because back then, there was a thing called phosphor burn-in, right? Color televisions, actually, if you left the same image on it, it would burn into the screen, to the chemistry of the materials, to the light-emitting materials on the screen. So we had a thing called attract mode, which would start changing the colors and moving things so that you didn't all have the exact same colors on the exact same spot, particularly in a brightness. So we had phosphor burn-in to contend with. And one of the corollaries of that was there was a rule that said, if you are not doing a space game, you can't have a black background with colored objects on it. Because the black background with like white stars, or the black background with like a white maze or a blue maze is exactly the thing that would cause bad phosphor burn-in. So the rule was, if it's not a space game, it can't be black background. Now, Pac-Man itself had a black background with a blue maze. I find this to be almost very, very fascinating. It did not occur to me that it had to have the same colors as Pac-Man Arcade in order to be Pac-Man. I thought if you had ghosts and a maze and dots and a Pac-Man, you'd be Pac-Man. So I put a light orange maze on a light blue background, as I recollect. I'd have to go look at it because it's like
Yeah.
And that obviously did not look like Pac-Man. And in addition to that, Pac-Man, the game, had these channels to the left and the right that you could scurry out of and circle around the screen. You leave the right side, you come back on the left side. And the nature of the beast is that in the actual display generation for the 2600, you're already doing unique things at the top and bottom. And it's like specific individual code that only runs at the very top and specific individual code that only runs at the very bottom. And to have put channels in the middle, I would have had, a different kind of row than the ones that have dots and maze walls. It would have had to be, way more work to put it on the sides and the top and bottom. I put it at the top and bottom. I thought, you have a channel that can be used to go around and around, and good enough. So, looked wrong, it flickered, the dots were long bars, like soap bar lozenges instead of dots. Like fruit didn't look like fruit. It's like, Jesus Christ, give me a break. I mean, really. So, you say that basically it's one of the most reviled video game releases in history. Let's be honest. There was a tremendous amount of criticism of the ways that it differed from the coin-op. Honestly, I go back and I may have rushed the sounds out without adequate attention, and I apologize for that. I am fascinated by the fact that no one in the whole organization knew that it had to be a blue maze on a black background. Right? If I would have gone and gotten, if I'd known how important that was, I would have gotten a waiver. I would have said, Pac-Man must be a space game. It's got to be black and blue. It's got to look like Pac-Man. Fact of the matter is, I thought it played enough like Pac-Man and felt enough like Pac-Man that it was Pac-Man.
Well, you worked on another legendary series, which was Swordquest. How did you come up with that idea, and how did it get started?
Well, so there was this question of what are we going to do to follow up Adventure, Warren Robinette's Adventure, which was a interactive video game, graphics game that was very similar in feel to the text-based dungeon adventure game that was there. And, at the time, my friend Howard, Mr. E.T., Howard Scott Warshaw, was doing games like Raiders, where he combined puzzle elements, almost an action adventure, I would say, because it was a Twitch game with thoughtful puzzles. If I do this, then that. We were at a brainstorming session, large corporate brainstorming somewhere in Monterey, and I just got the idea. So there's two facets to Swordquest. One is the literary element of it, right? It's a hero's journey. It's a grail quest. It brings in the mythical background of like the four elements. It brings in the Zodiac and the Kabbalah and the I Ching and the caduceus of Mercury, which is highly correlated with the Sanskrit chakra system. So it had all of this stuff all tied together as a literary framework for this story. And I kid you, this is really honestly the way I felt about it. It's like, it's a hero's journey. It's a grail quest. It's got these elements tied back to ancient mystical systems. I mean, literally ancient mystical systems. And Warner Communications, our parent company, also owns DC Comics and Franklin Mint. So let's do a contest. Let's build puzzles into the game that you actually have to solve, and then have DC Comics write comics and explain the story and have some of the clues from the puzzle, and have Franklin Mint make the actual physical prizes. And it was a very, I just censored the word grandiose. It was a very ambitious web network of all of these components that fit together. I'm very proud of the concept. And the games were meant to be some of the very, I say this with no intentional self-aggrandization, some of the very earliest action-adventure games, which were meant, even more than adventure. Adventure was not actually a hand-eye coordination challenge game at all. It was strictly an intellectual game. Go here, try to figure that out. It's a puzzle. These games I was intending, the vision was you actually battle your way through challenges. We're like raiders, actually. Battle your way through challenges and get the information you need to figure out an adventure. So, for instance, in the first one, and I did not code these games. I coded Fireworld, and I started coding Airworld, but Earthworld was done by Dan Hitchens. And it used the concept of the map of the rooms. It's like when you left one room to another, you'd go, where does this tunnel go? And if you drew out the map of the tunnels, you would end up with a picture of the 12 zodiac signs, and there are, the earth signs are connected to the earth signs. There's 4 different triangles built into the middle of the zodiac, and all around the circle was one set of tunnels, and across from fire sign to fire sign and fire sign to fire sign was another set of tunnels. So if you drew the map of the room, you would end up with a picture of the zodiac. Maybe. I mean, that's what the picture was. And then it had a lot of bits and pieces of imagery baked into it that were about that. And then it has a puzzle baked into it. And the puzzle, it was very ambitious.
Yeah, especially on the 2600. I mean, it's... And I know those games, I mean, obviously we'll get into kind of what happened with the series, but I'm quite interested in that background of the promotional contest things. I mean, that it's really well known for that, the real life treasures that people could win. I mean, where did that idea come from? And have you got any kind of behind the scenes memories of that?
That was just me going, we own Franklin Mint. Let's make real prizes. Literally. I mean, it was a brainstorm. We were at a brainstorming session, and that was a brainstorm. I mean, I am, as best as I recollect, and we are talking about more than half of my life ago, I was the first person ever to link Atari and Franklin Mint. And what I mean by that is, I mean, I just it's like, it just came to me. It's like, Franklin Mint made all of these kinds of collectibles, plates, little bits of jewelry. I don't really know, but they made, honest to God, valuable collectibles, and they were a sibling company. It's like, let's link up with them and actually make this game, put some skin in the game. It's like, this will be really, really fun. It'll be really fun to actually solve this puzzle and get a shot at a prize.
Well, what was your original plan for Airworld? Because Airworld was like a part of the Swordquest series, but it didn't end up getting completed. Why was that, and how did you feel about it?
Okay. So my original plan for Airworld was that it'd be based on the I Ching. So we went Zodiac, Kabbalah, chakra system. I don't know that much about Sanskrit, so that was the best I could do. But it is foundational, metaphysical, or mystical kind of information. A bit of a Berkeley hippie there. And the I Ching, right? The I Ching is foundational as far as mystical systems go. And what I was trying to do, where I stopped, Airworld. I don't consider Airworld will be done until recently someone released something they called Airworld, and it wasn't. I totally endorse what Atari and Digital Eclipse did there, but it's not Airworld. You can call it Airworld, but it's not Airworld, aside from the fact that it doesn't even run on a 2600.
I was going to ask, were you involved with that version that came out as part of the Atari 50th?
I was aware of, and I was consulted, and I go, this is great. This is great. It's too bad you're calling it Airworld. My vision for Airworld was that for each of the hexagrams of the I Ching, which is going to be 6 binary lines, a yin-yang and a yang line, which means you're going to have 64 unique play screens. I wanted to be able to derive from the 6 binary lines a set of gameplay rules that would make the gameplay be emergent and defined by the combination of yin and yang lines and trigrams. So where I stopped with the game was trying really hard to find a way to make 64 interesting games that were defined by a formula from the 6-bit binary number. So I was doing things like, one version is if you're in a yin line, you're chasing, there's things moving in each of these 6 bands, very much influenced by Taz, actually, or Quad Run. I think it was by Steve Wojda's really interesting game. Steve Wojda had a really interesting game where there were just objects in horizontal bands, and you as a player would jump between horizontal bands, and you'd want to do different things with different objects. So there was one where, so what I was looking at is you jump between horizontal bands, and in some cases, you're trying to grab as many of the things in horizontal bands as you can, and in others, you're trying to dodge them. So I was looking for this, if you're in this trihexagram, if you're in a yin-yang, you're trying to grab the objects. If you're in a yang line, you're trying to dodge them. And then the rules of the gameplay will have this formula which will make a game a unique 64 unique action games. And the thing is that once I started this, I found out that a lot of the games that I was coming up with were just plain stupid. Like the one where they're trying to hit you and you're trying to pick them up, right? So I'm trying to grab these objects are trying to avoid me. That's a not entirely boring game. They're running away, I'm chasing. The one where they're running to me and I'm running to them is kind of dumb. The one where, based on pairs or triads of lines, they're moving fast and, you're slow. Maybe I'm in quicksand, so I'm moving slow and they're moving slow is actually kind of interesting. But the one where they're moving slow and I'm moving fast is kind of dumb. So maybe a third of the games I was getting from my formulas were like, it was a third of them were actually kind of playable. A third of them were sort of like not so playable. And a third of them were just plain kind of dumb. So that's where that whole inquiry landed. And it's interesting because it kind of landed like how would I do the fair, visible slot allocation for a on-demand flicker system, which, 40 years later, I still think about it once in a while. 40 years later, I still think about what is the rule set, and maybe I'll do this as a hobby project on a PC when it's easier. What is the transform? What is the formula from the I Ching, the 6-bit number, to fun gameplay of those rows? I still think about it, and usually I think about it and go, oh, no, I got better things to think about. So that's
well, I think fans would love to see that, though. Would you ever do that? Maybe actually do Airworld for the 2600?
I've actually considered doing Airworld, so I'll tell you this about that. So it is really hard to write Atari 2600 cards. I remember it fondly. Oh, that was such a fun challenge. But I go back every now and then and try to start a little bit of retro exercise. It doesn't feel as fun as it did 40 years ago. It feels hard. I think it's hard. So I would consider, I do bring into mind the idea of, right now it's more aspirational than intentional. I actually think that for me to finish Airworld would be a lot of fun. It would be a lot of fun for, some people like Ernie Klein told me that Adventure and Swordquest were the most important games to him when he was young. And I'm really touched by that. And there are people who said that they really found Swordquest to be really, really engaging and really important as a part of their youth. And that's really wonderful. And so I would consider the making 64 games without a lot of, if I add a little bit of code here and there to maybe fix the games that suck, it's not what I want. I want one formula that takes 6 bits and makes 64 useful gameplay experiences out of that. And that may be not possible.
I think in terms of legacy, I mean, having the series complete, by you, I think that would be just a great way to wrap it up, wouldn't it?
So where I landed Swordquest is I had this whole flying screen, this screen with on the horizon, 64, the trigrams scrolling, so you could fly around and home in on a hexagram in the middle of the screen and fly straight to it, and it would expand to fill the screen. So one thing, I think that Airworld has to be an 8K card.
There are companies out there that make, Atari 2600 cards
what
today,
I'm saying is that between Pac-Man, when 8K wasn't an option, and the end of Swordquest, Fireworld's an 8K card, because in the intervening year, 8K became the norm. So I'm a bit of a purist. I'm not going to do a 16K card, for God's sakes. Yeah, it crosses my mind. I don't know that I have the gumption. And hypothetically, I could find one of the homebrew coders there are people out there who are really good 2600 coders.
Well, one thing I've got to ask, because I know our audience wouldn't forgive me if I didn't, being that there's been so many people talking about it over the years. Do you know the eventual fate of the prizes? Because I know there was rumors that, Jack Tramiel might have had it in his house. Or
I guess I'm allowed to have regrets. I paid very little attention to all of that. It's like by the time I was done with my part, A, the whole creative direction and story running, and B, writing a cartridge, I was on to the next programming and game development challenge, and I have no idea at all what happened with the prizes. There's some guy, rumor has it that one of the actual prize winners melted it down and sold it for parts so he could go to college. I believe that one of the prizes is actually in someone's safe deposit box. And the real question has always been what happened to the Sword of Sorcery, which would have been the $60,000 prize that we think, and no one knows. No one knows. And we think maybe it was in Atari's hands and the Tramels got it. It's entirely possible that it got lost between Franklin Mint and Warner and Atari. I know nothing about the connection between Franklin Mint and Atari. I would assume that somewhere at Franklin Mint is a business record, unless it's a Trump-owned company. I would assume that somewhere there is a business record, which is an invoice or a receipt or a shipping, I don't know, it's 40 years ago. I know nothing about the prizes. I never saw one.
There could be a documentary in that, though. It's fascinating.
Where did? Yeah, well, this would be an investigative journalism kind of story.
Well, Tod, it's been incredible hearing some of your memories about, your time at Atari. It's just, obviously, the golden age of video games and when it all started, so it's been wonderful to hear it from you. Today, I know you still go to conventions and stuff as well. Are you still kind of involved in the gaming world?
Well, I work for, right now, I've been consulting at Bethesda for a little bit on Starfield, and I'm hoping to get a situation where I'm consulting on the Elder Scrolls 6. Right now, I took some time off and worked on Internet of Things for a solar power company, and I spent some time at an AI startup. I was burned out on games 10 years ago, but now I'm thinking about games again. I'm back in the games industry. I've been on Starfield for a year. I'm leaving them. Hope to go back maybe for Guardians, and I'm just kind of feeling into what's happening in games now. I consider myself to be a tremendously fortunate person. I really enjoy working with people to use technology to develop engaging entertainment.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that passion still burns strong, Tod. And if you do decide to do your version of Airworld and get it out there one day, we'd love to have you back on to hear about it. So
well, I'll
keep in touch.
It's probably at least 3 months of really hard work.
Yeah.
I suppose there might be. Is there money in?
I'm sure there would be some. I'm not sure how much.
Maybe 3 months worth of compensation. Well, thank you so much for your. I hope I was informative and entertaining. And thanks for your company.